The largest Crusader army ever assembled marched out of its fortified camp on the morning of July 3rd, 1187, carrying the True Cross. It had enough knights, infantry, and military order warriors to meet any threat the Ayyubid Sultan had assembled in a decade of preparation. It had water behind it at the springs of Sephoria, one of the strongest defensive positions in the kingdom. It had a commander, Raymond of Tripoli, who had spent his adult life studying exactly this kind of war. Raymond argued clearly and on the record that they should not move. The council agreed with him. Then, after the meeting broke up, that decision was reversed. 2 days later, the army was gone, captured, destroyed, or scattered across a waterless plateau in the July heat. Jerusalem fell 3 months after that. What happened in those 2 days was not inevitable. It was the consequence of a single night, a single reversal of command in a terrain that punished every mistake without mercy. How the most powerful army the Kingdom of Jerusalem had ever put in the field managed to destroy itself, and how Saladin had engineered the conditions to make that destruction possible, remains one of the most studied questions in the history of the Crusades. The Kingdom of Jerusalem in the 1180s was a state under permanent strategic compression. Saladin, Sultan of Egypt and Syria, had spent more than a decade consolidating control over the region surrounding the Latin East, taking Damascus in 1174, Aleppo in 1183, and Mosul the following year. By 1187, the kingdom was encircled on every landward side by Ayyubid territory for the first time in its history. The Crusader states had survived previous encirclements, partly through military competence, partly through Saladin's own political constraints, and partly because individual commanders, most notably the young leper King Baldwin IV, had managed to defeat Saladin's invasions before they could consolidate. The Battle of Montgisard in 1177, where a Templar-led force caught Saladin's army dispersed and routed it entirely, was still within living memory. Saladin himself had survived that day on the back of a pack camel. The kingdom had not been broken, but the margin had been narrowing. The internal politics of the kingdom had deteriorated sharply after Baldwin IV's death in 1185. A succession dispute produced a king, Guy of Lusignan, whose legitimacy was contested across the nobility, and whose political survival depended on the support of two men, Raynald of Chatillon, Lord of Carac, and Gerard de Riedefort, Grand Master of the Templars, whose judgment on strategic questions was, by 1187, deeply compromised by personal rivalry with Raymond of Tripoli. Raymond, who had served as regent for the child king Baldwin V and had made his own peace with Saladin to stabilize his counties. Northern frontier was now formally reconciled with Guy but remained politically suspect. That suspicion would have consequences. The crisis began with Raynald. In late 1186, in violation of an active truce, he attacked a Muslim caravan traveling between Cairo and Damascus. Contemporary accounts make clear that the caravan was large, the attack was deliberate, and the goods and prisoners were not returned despite Saladin's formal demand. According to multiple sources, Guy acknowledged the violation was indefensible but lacked the political standing to force Raynald's compliance. Saladin, who had sworn to kill Raynald personally for this breach, spent the winter of 1186 to 1187 assembling the largest army he had yet commanded. Modern scholarly estimates for his force at Hattin range from around 20,000 to 40,000 men, with approximately 12,000 of that figure being cavalry, a proportion that gave his army exceptional mobility and striking range. Contemporary Muslim sources claim figures as high as 80,000, but these reflect the standard chronicle practice of magnifying numerical superiority to enhance the significance of a victory. Modern historians generally work within the lower range. The Crusader army that responded was also exceptional, in fielding somewhere between 15 and 20,000 men, including around 1,200 to 1,300 knights. King Guy had stripped the garrisons of virtually every castle and fortified town in the kingdom. Contemporary accounts confirm that the army assembled at Sephoria on July 2nd represented the full military strength of the Latin East, and that this meant the cities themselves were now nearly undefended. The relic of the True Cross, carried by the Bishop of Acre, traveled with the army. Its presence was not merely ceremonial. It was intended as a guarantee of divine sanction, a theological commitment to the outcome of the campaign. Before the march, there had been one more blow to the kingdom's military capacity that modern scholarship consistently identifies as a contributing factor. The Battle of Cresson, fought on May 1st, 1187. Saladin's son, al-Afdal, had led a reconnaissance force into Galilee under a safe conduct agreement with Raymond, who was obligated by his personal truce with Saladin to allow passage through his territory. Gerard de Riedefort encountered this force at the springs of Cresson and charged it with a force of fewer than 150 Templars and a small number of Hospitallers, against a column that multiple accounts place at several thousand cavalry. Raymond's knights, present but operating under the terms of the safe conduct, did not join the charge. The result was a near total destruction of Gerard's force. Only a handful survived, including Gerard himself. Contemporary sources record that around 150 Templar knights and 300 foot soldiers were lost at Cresson. The military historian Jonathan Phillips has noted that the damage to Frankish morale and military strength in the weeks before Hattin should not be underestimated as a contributing factor to what followed. There was one feature of the terrain between Sephoria and Tiberias that every experienced commander in that army understood before the march began, and it would decide everything. The road from Sephoria to Tiberias crossed approximately 26 kilometers of waterless hill country in the July heat of Galilee. There were no reliable water sources along the route. The springs at Sephoria itself, which the army had been using for days, would be left behind the moment the march began. Saladin knew this. The siege of Tiberias, where Raymond's wife was trapped in the citadel, had been designed, according to most modern historians, precisely to draw the Crusader army onto that road. Raymond argued at the council on the night of July 2nd that the correct response was to stay at Sephoria, hold the position, and wait. He was willing to sacrifice his own city and his wife's safety to preserve the army. A near contemporary account records him saying that Tiberias could be retaken later, but that a defeated army could not be rebuilt. The council ended with Raymond's recommendation upheld. Then Gerard de Riedefort went to Guy's tent. What passed between them is not preserved in any surviving source. What is documented is that by morning, the order to march had been given. A contemporary letter records that the army's leaders were surprised when the command came. The reversal had been total and unexplained. Guy had been humiliated in 1183 for failing to fight when battle was expected. That humiliation and the political pressure applied by those around him, who had no interest in preserving Raymond's strategic judgment, proved sufficient. The army moved on July 3rd. The march was a tactical catastrophe from its first hours. Saladin's mounted archers, organized under multiple divisional commanders and resupplied during the night with 400 loads of arrows, harassed the column continuously. The springs at Turan, reached by midday, were insufficient to water an army of this size. Guy pushed the march past Turan without allowing the army to rest. By afternoon, the column was fragmented. The infantry was failing under the combination of heat, thirst, and constant arrow fire, and Raymond's vanguard was being separated from the main body. Imad ad-Din al-Isfahani, Saladin's secretary and an eyewitness to the campaign, recorded that the Ayyubid archers were targeting horses specifically, a systematic effort to strip the knights of their primary tactical advantage. Multiple accounts confirm that by the time the army reached the plateau near the horns of Hattin, horses were dying in significant numbers from dehydration and arrow wounds. The structure of the Crusader column on July 3rd illustrates the command problems that compounded the tactical ones. Raymond of Tripoli led the vanguard with his own contingent. Guy commanded the main body. The rear guard, the most exposed position, subject to the heaviest harassment, was shared by Balian of Ibelin, Jocelyn of Edessa, and the military orders. The Templars at the rear bore the fiercest pressure and suffered accordingly. Contemporary accounts describe the rearguard being driven almost to breaking point before nightfall, and the army's overall cohesion deteriorating as the column stretched and gaps formed between divisions. The infantry, whose function was to screen the cavalry from arrow fire, began to break apart under the combined stress of thirst and continuous attack. A near-contemporary Latin account records that some infantry were already calling out that they were dying of thirst before the army had made camp for the night. The cavalry could not function without the infantry. Screen. The infantry could not hold its formation without water. Each failure accelerated the other. The Crusader column halted on an arid plateau below the Horns, the twin volcanic hills that gave the battlefield its name. As darkness fell on July 3rd, the army was surrounded. Ibn al-Athir, drawing on his own access to Muslim accounts, including the eyewitness testimony of Saladin's son al-Afdal, records that the encirclement was so complete that, in his words, a cat could not have escaped the camp undetected. The army had no water. Saladin ordered fires set in the surrounding scrubland. Whether the fires were deliberate or partially accidental remains disputed between Ibn al-Athir and Imad ad-Din's accounts, but both agree that by the morning of July 4th, the burning grass added smoke and heat to an army already at the edge of its endurance. The infantry, according to multiple sources, made an attempt to rush toward the Sea of Galilee for water. The attempt failed. Some were destroyed in the effort. Others retreated to the hills in a mass that effectively removed them from the battle before it had formally begun. What remained on the plateau on the morning of July 4th was a cavalry force. The knights, the military orders, the mounted sergeants, surrounded, dismounted in significant numbers by arrow fire, and without infantry support. Raymond launched 2 charges against the Ayyubid lines, the second of which succeeded in reaching the lake. Saladin, according to Ibn al-Athir, simply opened a gap in his lines to let Raymond through, a tactical choice that left Raymond outside the battle with nowhere to turn the escape into a counterattack. The rest of the army fought on. The decision that had been made the previous night, to advance rather than hold, was now delivering its full consequence. 3 charges by the remaining knights failed to break the encirclement. King Guy ordered the royal tent pitched on the horns themselves as a rallying point. Al-Afdal, Saladin's son, who was present and later recorded his account for Ibn al-Athir, describes watching his father's composure break briefly when the first charge nearly reached them, and then watching it restored when the line held. The true cross was captured near Guy's tent. Guy himself was taken prisoner. Reynald of Chatillon was captured alongside him. Contemporary accounts agree on what happened next. Saladin offered Guy water in his tent as a signal of mercy toward a captured king. He then brought Reynald before him and, according to both Muslim and Latin sources, killed him personally with his own hand. The oath Saladin had sworn after Reynald's caravan raid was kept. The military orders paid the highest price. According to Ibn al-Athir, Saladin ordered the execution of all captured Templar and Hospitaller brothers, sparing only the Grand Master of the temple, Gerard de Riedefort, who was held for ransom. Contemporary sources suggest that between 200 and 230 knights of the military orders were executed in the aftermath, beheaded by scholars and volunteers whom Saladin allowed to perform the task. The common soldiers who survived the battle were enslaved in such numbers that, according to near-contemporary accounts, the price of a slave in Damascus briefly collapsed. One source records a captive being exchanged for a pair of shoes, a detail that appears in multiple chronicles and is treated by modern historians as broadly credible, if possibly exaggerated. The numbers that escaped the battle intact were small. Most scholars agree that of the roughly 15 to 20,000 who had set out from Sephoria, only a few thousand infantry managed to scatter into the surrounding countryside and eventually reach fortified positions. Of the 1,200 knights who had ridden out with the army, only a handful of barons, Raymond of Tripoli, Balian of Ibelin, and a small number of others, escaped capture or death. The army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, as a field force, had ceased to exist. What followed was as fast as it was comprehensive. Saladin's forces moved through the kingdom's cities and castles in the weeks after Hattin. Acre fell on July 10th. Nablus, Jaffa, Sidon, Beirut, and Ascalon followed before mid-September. The cities had almost no garrisons. The men who might have defended them were either dead, enslaved, or captive on their way to Damascus. 52 towns and fortifications fell in the months after Hattin, according to the account of Raymond of Tripoli's escape recorded in near-contemporary Latin sources. Only Tyre held out, saved by the fortuitous arrival of Conrad of Montferrat with a small Italian fleet. Jerusalem itself was defended by women, clergy, refugees, and Balian of Ibelin, one of the 4 barons who had escaped Hattin, who had entered the city on a safe conduct granted by Saladin himself. The city held out for 12 days, before surrendering on October 2nd, 1187, 88 years after the First Crusade had taken it. The consequences of that date spread across the Latin world with unusual speed and force. Pope Urban III, according to the chronicler Ernul, died of shock when news of Hattin reached Rome. Though this account is treated with caution by modern historians, who note the proximity of Urban's death to other political stresses. His successor, Gregory VIII issued the papal bull Audita Tremendi on October 29, 1187, before news of Jerusalem's fall had even reached him, calling for the Third Crusade. In England and France, the Saladin tithe was enacted, a 10% levy on income and movable property to fund the crusade. 3 European monarchs eventually took the cross. Frederick Barbarossa, Holy Roman Emperor, drowned in the Salaf River in 1190, his army disintegrating without him. Philip II of France and Richard I of England arrived by sea and fought the siege of Acre through 1191. By the Treaty of Jaffa, signed in September 1192, Richard secured a coastal strip and the right of Christian pilgrimage to Jerusalem. The city itself remained under Ayyubid control. Raymond of Tripoli, the man who had argued most clearly against the march, died of pleurisy later in 1187, within months of the battle he had tried to prevent. Gerard de Riedefort, ransomed from Saladin's custody, was killed 2 years later at the siege of Acre in 1189. Reynold of Chatillon, whose caravan raid had given Saladin the justification he had been constructing for years, was dead within hours of the battle's end. King Guy of Lusignan, released by Saladin in 1188 after swearing not to bear arms against him again, an oath he immediately renounced, spent the next years in a contested attempt to reclaim a kingdom that no longer had its capital. The True Cross, captured at Hattin, was reportedly sent to Damascus. It disappears from the historical record entirely after that point. Its fate is unknown. The Kingdom of Jerusalem survived Hattin in a legal and territorial sense, reduced to a coastal strip, with its capital eventually shifted to Acre, for another century until the fall of that city in 1291. But the kingdom that had been defended at Montgisar, that had twice stopped Saladin's armies before they reached its core, never recovered the interior. The field army that had made those defenses possible was destroyed in 2 days on a waterless plateau in Galilee, 90 kilometers from Jerusalem, by a decision made after midnight on July 2nd that reversed the correct judgment reached an hour before. Historians studying the battle have argued extensively over where the fatal error lay, in Guy's reversal, in Gerard de Riedfort's influence, in the structural political fractures that made cohesive command impossible. What is not disputed is the arithmetic of the aftermath. 52 fortifications, 1 holy city, an entire kingdom, surrendered in 3 months. Saladin had not destroyed the kingdom of Jerusalem on the field. He had waited for the kingdom to destroy itself on the march to Hattin, and then he collected what remained. This was Empyrean archive, where the past still rides.